So hello everyone for our viewers on Zoom and on YouTube. So today in the Let's Talk Primate series, we have Professor Cyril Grueter. Cyril is a senior lecturer at University of Western Australia. His research interests lie at the interface of behavioral ecology and evolutionary anthropology, and include the evolution of primate human sociality and the mechanisms underlying social cohesion. Cyril has a PhD in biological anthropology from University of Zurich, during which his work aimed at understanding evolutionary determinants of multi-level societies in primates, which included field observations on wild snub-nosed monkeys in China. For his postdoctoral research at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, he worked on the feeding ecology and feeding competition in mountain gorillas in Rwanda. His current projects include understanding sociality in various primate groups such as chimps, colobus monkeys, snub-nosed monkeys, to name a few. So for today's talk, the title of the talk is Primate Origins of Xenophilia, a Cornerstone of Human Sociality. Over to you, Grueter.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me today. I'm very excited to tell you a little bit more about my research. So what I want to do tonight is to give you a big picture overview of the work that I've been doing over the past 15 years. Most of my work has been on non-human primates, but I've also done some behavioral research on humans. So what I'm trying to do now is to amalgamate the human and the primate side of things. And I would also like to mention some of the research that I have in the pipeline that I plan to do in the future. So you've already mentioned the title of my talk, The Primate Origins of Xenophilia. By xenophilia, I mean intergroup tolerance and cooperation. I guess I can skip that slide. You've already introduced me, so let's jump straight in. So my general research interests include the evolution of primate and human sociality, and my particular interests revolve around the evolution and functional significance of what I call metagroup organization. By metagroup organization, I mean things like between group tolerance, between group interactions that are sociopositive, that are not agonistic, between group cooperation, and also the formation of higher level groupings or multi-level societies. So why do we even care about that? Well, I would argue that understanding sociality at multiple levels has important implications for a lot of things, including information transmission, disease transmission, cognition, and sexual selection. And you will hear more about that later on. So if you look at non-human primates, intergroup relations are often characterized by animosity, and that's because of resource and mating competition. And a prime example of intergroup tolerance would be bonobos peacefully intermingling bonobo communities. So there are instances of peaceful encounters, mutual tolerance, and temporary fusion between groups in non-human primates. So not all intergroup interactions are necessarily agonistic. And mutual tolerance between groups is nicely exemplified by species that live in complex multi-level societies, such as snub-nosed monkeys. And here's a few papers that I've published with my colleagues over the last, 10 plus years on primate multi-level societies. We just recently published a paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution that really summarizes the evolution, the causes and the consequences of living in such a complex sociality. So what are multi-level societies? Here's the definition. Multi-level societies are present when core units maintain proximity and coordinate activities with other core units and thereby form one or more successively higher social levels of grouping. And you can see that illustrated here. You've got the core units up here, then you've got higher order groupings all the way up to the apex tier or the apex level. So if we look at the primate or the mammal phylogenetic tree, you can see that multi-level societies show a patchy distribution. They have evolved in a few primate taxa, and also in a handful of non-primates, including some whales and zebras and and elephants, of course. So here's another illustration that shows you how multi-level societies are structured. Here you can see 3 different species that exhibit multi-level societies. There are obviously some differences among those species, but what all of them have in common is that there are at least two social layers. And the first one is the stable 1 male unit with 1 male and multiple females. And then there's the higher level band. And what's also interesting is that there's often bachelor groups that are at the periphery of the band. You can see them depicted here. All right, let's shift gear for a moment. What about human intergroup interactions? We all know that human intergroup relations span the whole gamut from extreme hostilities to tolerance, affiliation, and even alliances. So humans essentially live in a multi-level social system whereby smaller units are embedded within larger ones. But compared to primates, we have pretty expansive interaction networks, much larger interaction networks than non-human primates. And the 3 classic tiers of small-scale human societies are the family, the band, and the tribe. And even if we look at the virtual world, I mean, there's studies showing that there's fractal multi-level organization of human groups in a virtual world. So even when we use large-scale internet-based social network data, we can see the same type of multi-level structuring. So this is an omnipresent phenomenon. So how did I go, or how do I go about studying multi-level societies or intergroup tolerance? I've used a multi-pronged approach to address the question of why such systems evolved and what the causes and consequences of living in such a system are. And I would argue that the evolution and function of large-scale integration in humans and primates remains a really exciting unresolved area of research in biological anthropology and primatology. So in terms of my approach, I've done field research on suitable model species, in particular the snub-nosed monkeys. I've done comparative analyses, trying to trace the evolutionary origin of social integration and its socioecological determinants. And I've also done cross-cultural analyses, looking at intergroup tolerance in traditional human societies. And you'll hear more about that later on in my talk. So first of all, let me talk a little bit about the causes and consequences of primate multi-level societies. So this is really the first line of inquiry that I want to share with you tonight. So I conducted a 2-year study on the black and white snub-nosed monkey in temperate China. This is a species that was known to live in groups of several hundred, but very little was known about its social organization. My study site is located in southwestern China, in northwestern Yunnan province, near the border to Tibet. So this is really the eastern edge of the Himalayas. Some of those mountains are nearly 6,000 meters high. The terrain, as you can see from this photograph, is very rugged and the slopes are very steep. So it's a difficult place to do field work, that's for sure. All right, so at my study site in Yunnan in China, I followed the snub-noses for roughly 20 months, and I established contact with them on an average of 12 days per month. And initially, the group was not habituated. So I basically copied Jane Goodall in my research approach. What I did is I used group scans using a spotting scope. And during those scans, I recorded the activity and proximity patterns of my study subjects. So I had to wait for months to get an opportunity to obtain a reliable group count. It was probably about 12 months into my study when the group crossed a gully high up in the mountains, and this allowed me to get a reliable count of the group. And the total number of individuals that I counted in the group was 407, and that's a really large group by primate standards. So when the group crossed that open area, what I did is I recorded the time intervals between successively passing individuals, and I used those time intervals to detect social boundaries within the group. So here you can see the time intervals between arriving adult and subadult males, and you can see that the individuals, the males, they are not randomly distributed across the group. So if this were a macaque-like multi-male, multi-female group, we would expect the spacing of the males to be more random. But according to a runs test, the males, they were not randomly distributed. You can see that the peaks occur at regular intervals here, and this is most compatible with a multi-level society. And you can also see that there's a bunch of males here clumped at the periphery. So these are the all-male units that led the progressions. And when I did my group scans, I identified the nearest neighbors of my scanned individuals. And you can see that in only 1% of observations was another male the nearest neighbor of a scanned male. And this is evidence that we're dealing here not with a multi-male, multi-female group, but a multi-level society of core one-male units that are part of a larger band. If it were a multi-male, multi-female group, we would expect males to have other males as nearest neighbors much more often. So now that we've established that they live in a multi-level society, we need to ask ourselves, what are the adaptive benefits of living in a multi-level society? But before we can address that question, we need to know what allows these primates to form such large bands. Presumably, they must face relatively little feeding competition or ecological constraints. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to live in such super large bands. Now, how do we measure ecological constraints? You may have heard of scramble competition. Scramble competition is often demonstrated by showing correlations between group size and daily travel distance. Larger groups, they deplete food patches more quickly, so they have to travel farther in order to get a sufficient amount of food. So if you look at these two correlations here, so I correlated group size and daily travel distance for two different colobines. Rhinopithecus bieti, the black and white snub-nosed monkey, and the Thomas langur. Thomas langurs are tropical dwelling colobines, whereas snub-noses are temperate dwelling colobines. So you can see that there's a positive correlation in both cases here. But if you look at the Thomas langurs, you can see that the slope is much steeper. It's actually steeper by a factor of 30 if we compare the regression slopes between these two species. So what does this analysis tell us? Well, first of all, it tells us that scramble competition is much higher in the tropical dwelling colobine than in the temperate dwelling colobine. And it also tells us that ecological constraints prevent higher level groupings in these temperate colobines. In these tropical colobines, because the ecological constraints are higher in the tropical colobines, so that's why they are prevented from forming such super large bands, whereas Rhinopithecus bieti can easily add additional group members and form larger groups. There's hardly any disadvantage of doing that. All right. Well, so why do they face limited scramble competition? So in order to answer that question, we need to look at their resource base. And on an annual basis, we found that it was 67% lichens. So this is an unusual food resource for primates. Very few primates rely almost exclusively on lichens. In winter, more than 90% of their diet was lichens. So it's an important fallback food that they rely on when their preferred foods, young leaves and fruits are unavailable. So it's the abundance of lichens that probably allows them to form such super large bands. And now we can turn to the functional significance of multi-level societies. One hypothesis that has gained prominence is the bachelor thread hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, social units, they coalesce in order to decrease harassment, risk of takeovers, and infanticide by bachelor groups. So the 1 male unit males, they gain a benefit from forming bands. They reduce that risk coming from the bachelor males. Now, if this hypothesis is true, then the probability of being targeted and ousted by bachelor males declines as band size increases. We know that those bachelors form all male groups that habitually follow the reproductive bands, and they pose a significant threat to the 1 male unit leaders. And we also know that these bachelors can be infanticidal. So I did a comparative analysis across Asian colobines, and I predicted that the presence of multi-level societies should be related to the number of bachelor males in the population. So I used the ratio of females to males in bisexual units as a proxy for bachelor threat. You can see the proxy for bachelor threat here on the y-axis, and you can see multi-level colobines contrasted with non-multi-level colobines on the x-axis, and you can see there is significant difference between these two. So the higher this value, the higher this sex ratio, the more males are expected to be excluded from the breeding units. So that means bachelor threat is higher. And this significant difference here means that in multi-level colobines, more males are excluded from bisexual units, so bachelor threat is expected to be higher in those multi-level colobines. So each data point represents one species of colobine, so that was a comparative analysis. And since all species with multi-level societies also show substantial home range overlap, I used home range overlap as a continuous proxy measure for multi-level societies. And again, you can see here this proxy for the proxy for bachelor threat here now, and you can see this proxy for multi-level societies on the y-axis, and there's a positive correlation here. So the sex ratio of bisexual groups showed a significant positive correlation with home range overlap. And in these regressions, we controlled for phylogeny by means of independent contrasts. So on theoretical grounds, the bachelor threat hypothesis was supported. There was more home range overlap or a higher prevalence of multi-level sociality when bachelor threat was higher. So this safety in numbers effect that we have demonstrated may suffice to minimize the risk of a male takeover, but an additional way to increase resistance to bachelors would be to engage in collective defense, would be for the 1 male unit leaders to engage in collective defense to keep the bachelors at bay. So the question is, does such collective defense actually exist in multi-level societies? We know that group-level coalitions of males that cooperate aggressively against neighboring groups is quite common in primates, but cooperation between units is basically unheard of. So that's what we wanted to look at next. So in order to find out if such collective action among units exists in a multi-level society, I turned to a habituated group of golden snub-nosed monkeys that lives in the Shenongjia Nature Reserve in central China, near the Three Gorges Dam. So there were a total of 4 one-male units and 1 all-male units in that population. And we did actually end up observing males of different units showing collective action. We saw the resident males collectively chasing and expelling members of the bachelor group. They also went on patrols together, as you can see here, and sometimes we saw them scanning the surroundings for possible intruders. We don't really know if this is genuine cooperation where they engage in coordinated action, or if every male was just simultaneously rushing toward the threat stimulus. We're not sure about that. But we did find that rates of collective action were higher during the mating season when the risk of bachelor incursions is elevated. And we also looked at the relatedness of the males in the 1 male unit, and we wanted to establish whether these acts of cooperation are based on kinship. So we collected hair samples, we did microsatellite genotyping, and according to the data on relatedness among the 4 resident males that my collaborators got, we concluded that the males are principally unrelated. The average coefficient of relatedness among the 1 male unit males was very low. So male cooperation in this case is probably best understood in terms of the mutual direct benefits that individuals gain through collective action and not through kin selection. So what next? We still have an incomplete understanding of multi-level societies, So I'm thinking of a lot of different avenues that could be pursued to shed light on the causes and consequences of multi-level societies. So first of all, our knowledge of the social structure of bachelor groups has clearly lagged behind that of breeding units. We don't really know how stable those bachelor associations are. We don't know what the effects of dominance, age, and kinship are on the social structure. And we don't know if these social bonds are stable or if they temporarily deteriorate when reproductive opportunities arise. So that's during the mating season and when bachelors are in close spatial proximity to the band. So we have already addressed some of these questions in two populations of snub-nosed monkeys, maybe I should say in two species of snub-nosed monkeys. And some results, some preliminary results have already been published. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what this picture is doing here. It's supposed to be up here. So this is the first paper that was recently published. Here we looked at grooming rates in a black and white snub-nosed monkey all-male unit, and we found that the all-male unit social network had a significantly lower centralization and a lower clustering coefficient during the mating season compared to the non-mating season. Again, reproductive conflict is much higher during the mating season than during the non-mating season. If you're not familiar with these social network terms, clustering coefficient measures the degree to which nodes in a network tend to cluster together, and centralization describes the extent to which connections are focused around one particular individual. And this is the second study that we did on golden snub-nosed monkeys in yet another population. This heat map on the left shows the relatedness among members of the golden snub-nosed monkey all-male unit. So the number inside the cells represents the estimated relatedness coefficient, and the dendrogram here on the left shows the dyadic association strength among males. And this dendrogram up here shows the pairwise relatedness coefficients. And you can see that the association matrix was significantly correlated with the relatedness matrix. So these two matrices, they were correlated, which means that male social affiliation was actually based on kinship in this instance. And on the right-hand side, you can see the spatial patterns of the all-male unit and breeding band. This is the all-male band in red, and this is the breeding band in blue or purple. And down here you can see community size, which is essentially a measure of affiliation strength among the all-male unit males. And here on the x-axis, you can see the distance between the breeding band and the all-male unit. And if you look at those lines here, you can see that once the all-male unit approached the breeding group to within about 200 meters, the strength of male bonds declined steeply. And it's at this distance that the bachelors can attract females. So there's possibly more male-male competition here. So relationship strength deteriorated when reproductive opportunities arose. And another topic that some of my colleagues and I have recently addressed is how promiscuity influences behavioral strategies in golden snub-nosed monkeys. There is one population of golden snub-nosed monkeys where sneaky extra-unit copulations are quite common. In multi-level systems, females can relatively easily achieve extra pair copulations because there's other males and other units nearby. So we were trying to understand the reason for that behavior. And one hypothesis that we tested is that females mate with males outside their one male unit to reduce the risk of infanticide should one of those males subsequently become the leader of their one male unit. So that's essentially the paternity confusion strategy. Infanticide has actually never been observed in this population, and that population has been studied for a quarter century. So it looks like infanticide is really absent in that population. And then my colleagues, they analyzed the paternity data, and they found that more than half of the infants were sired by males outside their one male unit. So they were sired as a result of extra pair matings. There was, for example, there was one bachelor male who mated with 3 females of an OMU, of a one male unit, and then later replaced the leader of that one male unit when those females were pregnant. And all offspring were sired by the new resident male. And he did not attack or kill any of these infants. So there seems to be a link between extra pair matings and lack of infanticide. So extra pair matings may result in decreased levels of infanticide or absence of infanticide. By the way, these monkey portraits here are the one male unit leader males, and the green nodes here are the females that engaged in extra pair matings, and the monkey silhouettes here are the bachelor males that were involved in extra pair matings. All right. We also know very little about the cognitive consequences of living in a multi-level society. In 2015, I published a paper demonstrating that home range overlap in primates, which could be used as a proxy for multi-level sociality, is correlated with brain size. You can see that here, home range overlap and brain size seem to be positively associated here. We don't really know why that is the case. Well, one could argue that this may have something to do with being able to manage interactions with neighbors. You know, distinguishing between friend and foe can be quite cognitively demanding, but it's also possible that it's not Machiavellian, but that there's an ecological reason for that relationship, that individuals need to remember the locations of neighboring groups' home ranges and their habitat utilization, and being able to predict where your neighbor goes next is probably also requires probably also quite a lot of brain power. We also know very little about how much social knowledge primates living in multi-level societies possess. One prerequisite for individual recognition is vocal individuality. So that's when vocalizations encode information about individuality. And this should be particularly adaptive in animals living in large, complex, multi-level societies, right? So my colleagues and I assessed the degree of individuality in coo calls of adult male golden snub-nosed monkeys. This is a very common call that is heard in a variety of contexts. I'm going to spare you the details here. But what we did find, and that was interesting, was that there were high levels of differentiation between individuals in these vocalizations. And they may provide cues for individual recognition. And again, being able to individually recognize individuals within your core unit and within neighboring units may be quite important in a multi-level context. And social transmission processes could also be affected by living in a multi-level society. A while ago, we trialed a social learning experiment where we see the different problem-solving techniques in different one male units. So we essentially used a baited box that could be opened in 2 different ways to recover food, either by sliding a door, or lifting a door. And the idea was to monitor the diffusion of knowledge within and across units. So the prediction was that there would be a tradition of lifting the door in one unit and a tradition of sliding the door in another unit. Unfortunately, the experiment hasn't been completed yet. We've hit some problems, but this is something that I would definitely like to focus on again in the near future. And I also recently started exploring how sexual selection operates in a multi-level context. So first we did a comparative study on body mass dimorphism in Asian colobines. And we found that sexual dimorphism in body weight was significantly higher in multi-level colobines than in non-multi-level colobines. So this suggests that living in a multi-level society is associated with higher levels of male-male competition. In multi-level societies, as you already know, The 1 male unit males, they are more or less in permanent proximity, and they experience frequent and intense competition over mating access to females. And these 1 male unit males are also shadowed by bachelor males, which also compete with the resident males over access to females. So you would expect levels of male-male competition to be higher in a multi-level system. And we also looked at ornamentation in primates, in particular in primates living in multi-level societies. We were interested in demonstrating a group size and a social organization effect on the conspicuousness of ornamentation in primates. So ornaments are things like the upper lip warts in golden snub-nosed monkeys, beards in human males, the long nose of the proboscis monkey, or those red chest patches in geladas. And we predicted that male ornaments should be important in large groups because of limited social knowledge. Individuals are surrounded by lots of other individuals that they don't really know very well. And so ornaments should facilitate rapid recognition of male dominance and quality. And this information is important for both male rivals and for females looking for a mating partner. If you live in a smaller group, you can individually recognize your fellow group members, and through repeated interactions, you can get to know them and their status and their strength and their quality. So there's no need to display those fancy ornaments. So the predictions were that ornaments should be more pronounced in larger, more anonymous groups and in species with multi-level societies. Again, because in multi-level societies, the 1 male units are in close physical contact, so there's heightened conflict potential. And here's the result. This was a comparative study that was done across the board, across primates, using PGLS, phylogenetically controlled regressions. And we did find a positive association between group size and dimorphism in ornamentation. And if you look at this graph on the right, we did find that multi-level primates are much more colorful and much more brightly ornamented than non-multi-level primates. Multi-level primates were much more brightly ornamented than non-multi-level primates. Yeah, and the media think that we explained why hipsters grow beards, but what we really explained with this study was that there's a higher degree of dimorphism in both ornamentation and body size in multi-level societies, in large groups, and this reflects selection for amplified signals of individual identity, rank, or attractiveness in large and complex organizations wherein conflict may arise frequently and the individual recognition is limited. And in another recent study, we documented for the first time correlates of facial coloration in the brightly colored black and white snub-nosed monkey. They have these luscious red lips. That's really the trademark of the species. And we measured lip coloration, and here you can see levels of lip redness in different age sex classes in both the mating season and the non-mating season. And if you look at the graph on the right here, you can see that levels of lip redness, you can see that during the non-mating season, levels of lip redness between the all-male unit males and the 1 male unit males, they were essentially the same. There was no difference at all. But during the mating season, you can see that levels of lip redness were much higher in the 1 male unit males than in the all-male unit males or the bachelor males. So there was fading of color in the all-male unit males, and there was reddening in the 1 male unit holders. So this tells us that lip coloration could be a badge of group holding status in snub noses. And it probably also means that the bachelors mask their maleness during the mating season to avoid conflict. At least that's one interpretation of those findings. So by signaling their status and their fighting ability, the males can reliably assess whether it's worth challenging a rival or not, and unnecessary conflicts can be avoided. It's a bit dark in here. All right, let's broaden the thematic scope a little bit in the last 10 or so minutes and look at metagroup organization. So by metagroup organization, I mean instances where social interactions transcend group boundaries and members of different social groups tolerate each other and sometimes even cooperate with each other. So multi-level societies represent one special form of metagroup organization. My former PhD student, Mel Merville, analyzed data on the causes and consequences of intergroup conflict in mountain gorillas in the Virunga volcanoes in Rwanda, where there's a high density and overlap among the gorilla group's home ranges. And so mountain gorillas show the whole spectrum from peaceful intergroup interactions to very hostile or even lethal attacks. I will never forget that morning. It was in June 2010 when a lone silverback showed up in our study group, and his arrival triggered a massive attack. The resident males and also some of the females started hitting and biting him. You can see this is the intruder here. So he was totally outnumbered by the 45 or so gorillas in the study group, and he had flesh wounds all over his body, and he died a few days later from an infection. So how do we explain that significant variation that we see in levels of conflict intensity when groups meet? It turns out that group familiarity has a significant influence on whether interactions remain peaceful or escalate. This graph here shows that when two groups met that had never been together, the majority of interactions between groups, they were actually agonistic. But when two groups met that used to be a single group prior to a fissioning event, then peaceful interactions were much more common. So this tells us that familiarity promotes peace in this instance. And during my postdoc at Max Planck and the Karisoki Research Center of the Dainfossi Gorilla Fund, I also carried out 18 months of field research on the feeding ecology of mountain gorillas and collected data on energy intake and expenditure. And we recorded the daily travel distance of groups of different sizes. And we found that group size and daily travel distance are positively correlated. Remember, we talked about scramble competition earlier, so that tells us that there's scramble competition. But interestingly, travel distances decreased for the largest group. They had less energy expenditure, and the largest group also had higher energy intake than the smaller groups. So this could mean that there's improved foraging efficiency of the largest group because of advantages in between group contest competition. So maybe the largest group has the competitive advantage over smaller groups and may have more exclusive access to high quality foraging grounds. And then there's a population of, it's not happy with the light in here, sorry. There's a population of colobus monkeys in Rwanda's Montaigne Nyungwe National Park, which exhibits unusually large permanent associations of about 400 or even 500 individuals. And until a few months ago, we didn't actually know how those supergroups were structured, how they were internally structured. My PhD student, Alex Miller, she tried to decipher the colobus social organization and to understand the ecological preconditions that allowed these primates to live in such extremely large groups. So what she did is she analyzed group progressions when the study group traveled. We time-stamped individual monkeys as they moved and identified all individuals at the level of the age-sex class. So here you can see the colobus crossing the main road in Nyungwe National Park. And then we extracted the social network structure from the spatiotemporal distribution of passing individuals. And so essentially individuals that pass in close temporal proximity to one another are more likely to be associated in a biologically meaningful way. And that's really the whole crux of the approach here. And what we found was that the groups were substructured. The society was actually based on predominantly multi-male, multi-female units. So this is unlike the snub-nosed, where we had one male units at the core. Here in these colobus, we have we have multi-male, multi-female units at the core, which is a social organization that hadn't really been recorded previously. And we also wanted to understand the ecological basis of supergroup formation, and our data, or I should say Alex's data, show that lichens are eaten in very large quantities, just like the snub-noses. These guys eat a lot of lichens, and these lichens are available year-round, and they're quite abundant, so they reduce the ecological cost of forming supergroups. And then we also measured patch depletion to get a sense of how abundant some of the colobus food items are. When the monkeys entered the food patch, which most of the time was a tree, we measured intake rate and movement rates over the patch occupancy period. You can, in this figure here, you can see that intake rates and distance, and you can see intake rates and distance moved here in the first and in the last quarter of patch occupancy. So when the colobus fed on young leaves, as you can see here, intake rates decreased and movement rates increased over the period of patch occupancy, which suggests that they experience resource depletion. However, when they fed on mature leaves, intake rates did not decrease over patch occupancy. So here, there was no depletion apparent. So one way of interpreting this finding is that mature leaves are super abundant and they facilitate supergroup formation in these colobus. Again, in the last few minutes, I just briefly want to mention that a major long-term goal of my work is to understand the evolutionary incentives for peaceful intergroup relations in humans, the ability to form affiliative ties with other groups, and to expand the scope of our interaction networks. That's really a derived trait of human sociality. It's a human universal. That doesn't mean that intergroup solidarity has replaced war. We all know that war is still omnipresent, but both phenomena characterize human societies. And it's been speculated what factors could promote or create an incentive for peaceful intergroup interactions, for independent groups to cooperate with one another. I just briefly want to mention that Douglas Fry, he came up with a very influential framework a while ago, and he was trying to understand the evolution of peace systems in humans, and he made a very strong case for the existence of peace systems in traditional human societies. And he hypothesized that there's a number of factors that are important in promoting intergroup tolerance. And one was interdependence, and one was interconnections among subgroups. I won't spend too much time on this. So intermarriage could be important here. Trade may be important in fostering affiliative between group ties. When groups specialize in the production of different trade goods, then they obviously have an incentive to be nice to each other. Some have argued that defense against hostile third parties could be a reason why groups form a confederacy. This may sound familiar to some of you, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But I think what united Indians in the last 2 centuries was really the hatred of the British rule. So they stopped their internal squabbling and unified the groups towards a common goal, which was to get rid of imperialism. And we saw the same during the Iroquois Confederacy of Native American tribes over a century ago. So this is another explanation for intergroup tolerance. And I did a cross-cultural analysis a while ago where I tried to understand which variables influence conflict between communities of the same society. So I predicted that between community tolerance should be higher, that is, conflict between communities should be lower with increasing levels of trade, intercommunity marriage, and external warfare. So these were the independent variables, and they were all extracted from the standard cross-cultural sample, which is a database containing data on 186 traditional societies. They are representative of all geographic regions and cultural clusters. And we did find an effect of trade on intergroup tolerance or intergroup affiliation. Marriage was not a significant predictor of lack of conflict between communities. There was an effect of warfare or of external warfare, but it was actually in the opposite direction as predicted. I don't have time to go into these results in more detail now, but hopefully one day I will be able to explore this question in more detail in a traditional small-scale society. I did do a pilot study a few years ago in the Solomon Islands on the Quayos. So these are very traditional horticulturalists, and they would be the perfect society to understand the determinants of intergroup peace, because they do establish trade relationships with neighboring communities, and they also have intermarriage. So this is a system that would allow us to explore the effects of these variables on intergroup tolerance. And we also did 2 field experiments to address the question of whether people are willing to help someone from another group. We did a lost letter experiment where we dropped 600 letters in various towns in rural Western Australia. And then we tallied how many letters were picked up by passersby and put in the mail. And the number of letters that were returned was used as a measure of cooperativeness or altruism. And we varied the location of the receiver of the letter. So letters were addressed to either an in-town resident or someone living in the Perth metropolitan area. And overall, 45% of letters were returned, and people were equally likely to help an in-group member and an out-group member. We did find a strong effect of socioeconomic status, so people living in towns of higher socioeconomic status, they were more likely to act altruistically and return a letter. And currently, we're also doing a study exploring if people are more likely to help strangers when they're supporting the same football team, when they wear the same team apparel. After a football game, one of my honor students, he asked fans for a favor, such as borrowing their phone. And our preliminary analyses showed that there was no evidence of in-group favoritism. People show no difference in attitude towards in-group and out-group members. And we're also looking at other variables that could influence people's willingness to be helpful, such as the outcome of a game, which is a measure of the threat of coming from the out-group. Okay, and this is my last slide, I think. Yep. And we're also interested in the proximate underpinnings of between-group tolerance. If you are in Australia, people often call you mate. Mateship is an Australian code of conduct which emphasizes loyalty and friendship. It's a bit like kinship terms such as brother, which function to form strong bonds among in-group members. But we don't know if these terms also play a role in establishing ties with out-group members. And to explore that possibility, we conducted an experiment where we recorded 2 sets of speeches by 3 male speakers. The first set contained the word mate, and the second didn't. And the 3 speakers, they had different accents. One had an Australian English accent, one had a British English accent, and one had spoke English with a Swedish accent. And the listeners were then asked to rank the speakers in terms of trustworthiness. And we found that listeners regarded speakers with their own accent as having higher trustworthiness. You can see that here. The trustworthiness ratings were highest for Australian English speakers. But using the word mate didn't make a difference. It didn't make the speakers more trustworthy. So this is a study that explored the proximate underpinnings of between group tolerance. And I'm not going to go into this. Another strand of research that I've pursued for quite a while is how primates adapt to extreme environments such as high altitude environments. As you know, I've done research on snub-nosed monkeys, on mountain gorillas and chimpanzees in Rwanda. And what all of them have in common is that they live at very high elevations. And maybe there will be an opportunity to go into this at another occasion. All right, thank you so much for listening. And that was really quite a broad overview of the sort of work that I've done over the past 15 years. And as you can see, I've approached the question of why and how multi-level sociality has evolved using a variety of different research approaches. And yeah, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cyril. Could you switch off screen sharing so that we can see you?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, that'll be awesome. Thank you so much. That talk was wonderful. Just to inform you, we have lots of people on YouTube who are very disappointed they are not able to participate in this talk. But we have only the AIP members over here who have some questions for you. Can I unmute them and they can ask you the questions? So can we have Rana sir? Rana,
I have roughly 5 minutes for questions because we're running a little bit behind schedule. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. So we'll
maybe I'll skip. Maybe the others can ask. I'll ask him later. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Partha, please unmute yourself quickly.
Okay. I mean, I can ask later as well. Not a problem at all. Go ahead. If anyone else, if no one has, then I will.
Partha, just quickly ask your question because it'll take the
all right. Okay. Hi Cyril, that was a really amazing talk. So, do you think in today's world, when more people are familiar with each other a little more, do you think familiarity, that the rhetoric of familiarity helps peace, is more evident today, or is it something different for humans?
I mean, we saw that with our gorilla study, that familiarity was really the main variable that explained peaceful intergroup interactions. So when individuals met individuals that they knew from the past, they were less likely to be aggressive towards them. And I believe that the same phenomenon exists in human societies. It would be really interesting to do more research on that. We see that in small scale societies, but we probably also see that on a more global scale now with increasing interconnectedness in the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before I move on with questions, would you be okay if we provide your email ID to our AIP group members so that they can come back to you with their questions? Because I'm sure
Absolutely.
a lot of them have questions.
I'm more than happy to answer questions via email. No worries.
So I'll quickly ask Mehereen to ask her question. Mehereen?
Yeah, hey, it was a very nice talk. So, so basically, my question is, are these large groups seasonal? For example, in Himalayan langurs that I worked with, we see that there are small groups which congregate together to form larger groups. Is it the same in snub-nosed monkeys too?
That's a very good question. Interestingly, the snub-noses, the larger groups, they are extremely cohesive. We only noticed one large-scale fissioning event, which lasted roughly, I think it was about a month or so, where the super large group split into two subgroups, and then they essentially foraged separately for a while, and then they later reconvened. We don't really know what the ecological or social trigger for that fissioning event was. It could have been related to reduced food availability. I think it happened in one study that was done by my colleagues. It happened during the bamboo shooting season. So maybe it would have been too competitive to remain in the large group. So that's why they decided to split into subgroups to reduce scramble competition. given the hard observation conditions, it's not easy to answer that question. But overall, our impression was that they were quite cohesive and there was very little fissioning and fusioning going on. Of course, during the day, sometimes they took separate travel paths simply because of the constraints of the habitat. They had to, keep a distance from each other for a little while, or they spread out a little bit to feed on different patches of food. But then in the evening, they all got together again. It's interesting that the Himalayan langurs are different in that regard. It's probably related to their food resource.
Yes, mostly. I think it could be. Yeah, thank you.
I think Ananya sir will have the last questions because his question
Sure.
probably will.
Yeah, Cyril, I know you're running out of time. Just two very quick questions. First is, when you see ornamentation going up in these multi-level societies, how do you remove the confound between individual identification, which you pointed out, as well as sexual selection, right? So is there any way of dissociating between the two? And the second question I had was that in your new form of social organization that you report, which is this multi-level, multi-male, multi-female organization that you saw in the colobus, would you think that's a more stable variant of the typically large fission-fusion groups that we see in rhesus macaques? Do you think it's a continuum from there? That's it. Thanks.
As for the first question, we honestly don't know how much individual recognition or how capable, let's say, snub-nosed monkeys are of individual recognition. I mean, they definitely are able to recognize the members of their own 1 male unit. They may be able to, recognize some of the males of neighboring 1 male units, but we don't know if they have this across-the-board individual recognition. So that's why we believe that those ornaments are really quite handy in this context, where you're surrounded by strangers or at least individuals that you're not perfectly familiar with. So we believe those ornaments are adaptive in these large multi-level groups. But I totally agree with you. We need to do more research on individual recognition abilities. For example, one way of doing that would be by setting up a playback experiment, as has been done with baboons and some other primates. And as for the colobus, the Angolan colobus, with the multi-male, multi-female units at the core of their multi-level society, this is really a social organization that hadn't been recorded before. We don't really know the evolutionary pathway that has led to that social organization. We know that in the case of the snub-noses, the multi-level society is the end product of 1 male units fusing together into a multi-level society, at least according to some phylogenetic analysis that we did, where we looked at the trait modularity or multi-level sociality. We did find that the ancestral pattern is an independent 1 male unit, and the derived pattern is a large multi-level society. We're not quite sure about the Angolan colobus in Rwanda. It's possible that the ancestral form was an independent multi-male unit, and that the derived trait would then be a multi-level society. We know that some Angolan colobus, they live in single male units, some of them live in multi-male units, and there's only 2 populations that we are aware of that live in multi-level societies.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cyril. Everybody else.
My pleasure,
Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to email him or get back to us for his email address. Partha, you're on.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Cyril. I won't keep you any longer. I know you are busy, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us. And we can have you again if you are okay with that. We can have more sessions like this over the period of time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to give another talk in the future. Yeah, as I mentioned in my talk, there's this whole other research project that I've been working on adaptations to temperate environments that I've only really scratched the surface of today. So there will be more opportunities. Thanks so much for the invitation again. And it's unfortunate that that glitch happened. Otherwise, we would have had a little bit more time to chat.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Have a good evening. Bye.